There are moments in a man's life that he cannot fully explain, not even to himself. Moments where everything you were trained to do, everything you were told to do, collides with something deeper. Something that lives in the chest, not the handbook. I was 26 years old, the first time I understood what it meant to truly stand your ground. Not on a battlefield, not in a training yard somewhere in Wiltshire with a sergeant screaming into your ear, but on a palace forecourt, in full ceremonial dress, in front of a woman whose title alone could end a career. And I didn't move. Let me take you back. Not to the moment itself, not yet. Because before you can understand what happened on that Tuesday in late October, you need to understand the man who was standing there. You need to understand where he came from, and why certain things were never going to bend in him, no matter who was asking. My name is James Calloway, Private First Class, Household Division, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards. That's how the paperwork read. That's what they called me at roll call. But where I came from, a narrow terrace house in Wolverhampton, the second of 4 boys, a mother who ironed her aprons before she put them on, I was just Jimmy. My dad worked the rail yards for 31 years. He had a back that ached in the cold and hands that looked like something carved out of old wood. He never complained, not once. I used to watch him at the kitchen table in the mornings, reading the paper before the rest of us were up, and I always thought, there's a man who holds himself together because it matters to him that he does. Not because anyone's watching, not because anyone asked him to, just because. That was my first education in what dignity actually looks like. My second came in the Army. I signed up at 18. Nothing dramatic about it, wasn't running from anything, wasn't chasing glory. I just knew in that quiet, certain way some people know things that I wanted to be part of something that had a standard, something that held itself to a line. Basic training was Purbright, then Catterick for infantry training. I was posted to the 1st Battalion after my assessment results came back, and a captain named McGregor shook my hand and said, "Calloway, you've got the temperament for ceremonial. That's a compliment. Don't waste it." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I do now. Ceremonial duty, and I mean true ceremonial duty, the kind where you stand motionless outside the most photographed buildings in the world for hours at a time, is not what most people think it is. They see the bearskin. They see the red tunic. They see the blank face and think that's just theater. It isn't. It's a form of discipline so complete that it becomes almost meditative. You learn to exist inside your own stillness. You learn that the body can ache and the mind can wander, and the crowd can press in from 10 feet away with camera phones and whispered jokes, and none of it gets to crack the surface. You are not a statue. You are a man choosing every single second not to react. That's harder than it sounds. My first posting to ceremonial duties was St. James's Palace, late spring, the year I turned 22. There's a particular kind of silence that exists in the early morning around those buildings, before the tourists, before the cars, before London remembers it's London. It settles over the stone and the iron and the old red brick like something almost sacred. I used to arrive early, not because I had to, because I liked standing in that quiet and feeling the weight of where I was, what had stood on that ground, what it meant. Some of the other lads thought I was strange for that. Sergeant Fowler, a man who had served for 19 years and had approximately 0 patience for anything he called romanticism, told me once, in the bluntest terms possible, that the buildings didn't care about my feelings. "They're buildings, Calloway," he said. "Stone and mortar, stop looking at them like they owe you something." "I don't think they owe me anything, Sergeant," I said. "Then why do you keep staring at them?" I thought about it, because I want to be worth standing in front of them. He looked at me for a long moment, then he walked away without another word. 3 months later, he put me forward for the Queen's Guard selection. There's a selection process that happens, and I won't detail every piece of it, because some things belong to the regiment and nowhere else. But the core of it is this: they're not just looking for a soldier who can stand still and look smart in a uniform. They're looking for a soldier who understands what the uniform is. The uniform isn't decoration. It isn't costume. It is a continuous, unbroken line from the men who wore it before you, through you, to the men who will wear it after. When you put it on, you are part of that line. And the line doesn't bend. The line doesn't accommodate inconvenience. The line doesn't pause because someone important is displeased. I understood that, I think, before I could articulate it. My selection officer, Captain Hargreaves, third-generation military, the kind of man whose calm was so complete it felt almost aggressive, asked me one question at the end of my selection interview that I've never forgotten. He leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers, and said, "Calloway, if someone with a title, someone significant, politically significant, asked you to do something that was outside your orders, not illegal, not dangerous, just outside your orders, what would you do?" I didn't hesitate. I'd tell them I couldn't do it, sir. Even if they outranked you. My orders come from the regiment, sir, not from titles. He wrote something down, didn't tell me what. The interview ended. 2 weeks later, I was on the rota for the Household Cavalry mounting at Horse Guards, and then, eventually, for the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace itself. There's a strange thing that happens the first time you stand outside those palace gates. You look at the crowd, and the crowd looks at you, and for a moment there's this odd recognition, like they're seeing something they half expected but didn't fully believe existed. A living piece of ceremony. A man inside a tradition so old it's become part of the skyline. Children point. Elderly tourists press against the railings with a kind of reverence that has nothing to do with you specifically and everything to do with what you represent. Americans, mostly, take photographs. Europeans sometimes try to engage you in conversation in the language that seems least likely to get a response. And sometimes, and these are the moments that stay with you, someone will stand very quietly a few feet away and just watch. Not for a photo, not for a reaction, just watching. I used to wonder about those people. What they were thinking, whether they were seeing something they needed to see, whether the stillness meant something to them the way it meant something to me. My mother came to see me on duty once. I didn't know she was coming, she hadn't told me. She'd taken the train down from Wolverhampton by herself, which she'd never done before, and she'd found the right spot outside the gates, and she'd stood there for almost 2 hours in a thin autumn coat watching her son stand motionless in a bearskin hat. I only found out afterwards, when she rang me that evening. I wasn't going to interrupt, she said. I just wanted to see. I asked her if she'd been warm enough. She didn't answer that. She just said very quietly, "Your grandfather would have been very proud, Jimmy." My grandfather, her father, had served in the army too. Korea, then Malaya, came back, worked a hardware shop in Dudley, never talked about any of it, died when I was 7. I remember him as a man of very few words and very precise movements, like someone who had learned to be exact as a form of respect. I held the phone for a moment after she said that. "Go on then, Mum," I said. "Put the kettle on." She laughed, which was what I needed her to do. The months leading up to the incident were, if I'm honest, difficult in ways that had nothing to do with the palace. My father had been unwell since the spring. Not critically, not the kind of unwell that makes you prepare yourself for the worst, but the steady, grinding kind that changes a man slowly. His back had got worse. His appetite had dropped. He was quieter than usual, which was saying something. I'd been back to Wolverhampton twice on weekend leave. Both times I'd sat at that same kitchen table where I'd watched him read the paper all those years ago, and he'd sat across from me, and we'd talked about football and local council nonsense, and the price of everything going up, and neither of us had said what we were both thinking. Which was that he was getting old, and I was far away, and neither of us quite knew what to do with that. I carried that weight back to London both times, carried it on duty, tucked it somewhere behind the stillness where it couldn't interfere, but where it lived, quietly, reminding me that the world outside the gates had its own weight, its own demands. That's the thing they don't put in the recruitment materials. You learn to carry things without it showing. The week before the incident, we'd had a briefing about an upcoming movement through the palace grounds. A formal occasion, the precise nature of which I was not directly involved in planning, and which I won't misrepresent here. What I can tell you is that there was a heightened sense of formality in the air. Extra briefings, small adjustments to positions, the kind of quiet administrative tightening that happens before something significant. Sergeant Fowler, who had, by this point, become something of an unofficial mentor to me, though he'd have hated that word, pulled me aside after the briefing and told me that my position for the following Tuesday would be the inner forecourt. The inner forecourt. That's not a position you receive casually. That's a position of trust. I nodded and said nothing. He looked at me for a moment. You'll be fine, Calloway. Yes, Sergeant. I'm not asking. No, Sergeant. He almost smiled. Don't make it strange. Sunday night before the Tuesday, I couldn't sleep. Which wasn't unusual before a significant posting. It wasn't nerves, exactly. It was more like alertness, a sharpening, the way a knife feels before it's used. I lay in my bunk in the accommodation block and stared at the ceiling and thought about my grandfather, about the way he moved, about what my mother had said on the phone that autumn evening about pride. I thought about my father at the kitchen table, older now, quieter. I thought about what Sergeant Fowler had said, you'll be fine. Not you'll do well, not you'll impress someone. Just you'll be fine. Which from Fowler was about as complete an endorsement as you were going to get. I thought about Captain Hargreaves and his question. If someone significant asked you to do something outside your orders, what would you do? I had answered without hesitation then. I hoped, lying there in the dark, that I would answer the same way when it actually mattered. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, a light wind coming off the river that made the forecourt feel sharper than usual. I dressed with the kind of care that has nothing to do with vanity. Every button, every strap, every surface of the uniform representing not just me, but the regiment, the tradition, the line I was part of. I did not rush. I did not cut corners. My senior corporal, a man named Preston, 12 years service, who had the hands of someone who'd never quite recovered from a childhood spent farming, checked me over and said nothing, which from Preston meant everything was correct. We moved into position. The inner forecourt of a royal palace has an atmosphere that is genuinely different from the outer gates. The tourists aren't here. The noise from the street is muffled. The architecture closes in slightly, and you become aware in a visceral way of the scale of what surrounds you, the stone, the history, the sheer accumulated weight of centuries. I took my position. I regulated my breathing. I became still, and I waited for whatever Tuesday was going to bring. It's strange, the things you notice when you're completely still. The world doesn't stop moving just because you have. It carries on in all its ordinary, slightly chaotic way, footsteps on stone, the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the walls, the muffled sound of a vehicle idling on the other side of the gate, a pigeon landing on the coping of a wall and then immediately changing its mind. The way cold air moves differently on your cheek than on your forehead. When you've been on ceremonial duty long enough, your attention sharpens in ways you don't expect. You begin to notice everything while reacting to nothing. It's an unusual state to live in, like being completely present and completely removed at the same time. I had been at my position on the inner forecourt for approximately 40 minutes when I first became aware that the morning was going to shift. It was small things initially. The movement of staff through the ground floor corridor that I could partially see from my position, movement that had a different quality to the usual purposeful back and forth. A quickened pace, a sense of adjustment. Then the sound of a door opening that carries a different weight when the person coming through it has an attendant. I had learned over years to read the approach of people by the way the space around them changed before they arrived. She came across the forecourt from the east entrance. And when I say she, I want to be precise here, because precision matters in a story like this. I'm not going to fabricate words, decisions, or private motivations for any real individual. What I witnessed, what I experienced, centered not on any royal personally, but on the chain of command that surrounds them, the officials and aides and members of the household staff who interpret, transmit, and sometimes misrepresent the intentions of those they serve. The figure who approached me was not the principal herself. It was her aide. A woman in her mid-50s, I estimated. Dark coat, a brooch at the collar. The kind of composed, precise bearing that comes from years of navigating the specific hierarchy of a royal household, where knowing your own authority depends entirely on whose name you're borrowing. She stopped approximately 8 feet from my position. Looked at me with the particular expression, not unkind, not warm, of someone who expects a task to be completed without resistance. And she spoke. "The protocol for this morning's procession," she said, her voice lowered but clear, Requires that station guards make a mark of personal deference as the principal passes. A single kneel. One knee, 3 seconds. I looked straight ahead. The requirement was not mine to interpret emotionally. It was mine to compare against what I had been briefed. And what I had been briefed did not include this. The briefing from Sergeant Fowler had been precise, as his briefings always were. Position, inner forecourt. Duration, as required. Behavior, standard ceremonial protocol, Queen's Guard standing orders. No deviation from standing orders, without written authorization from the duty officer. A single knee deferential kneel, for a standing guard in full ceremonial dress, outside the specific ceremonial occasions that require it, is not part of Queen's Guard standing orders. I did not move. The aide waited a moment. Then, did you hear me? Yes, ma'am. Then you understand what's required. I understand what you've described, ma'am. A pause, her expression shifted slightly. That's the same thing. With respect, I said, keeping my eyes forward, it isn't. Now I want to describe what this moment felt like from the inside, because it would be dishonest to make it sound simple. There is a particular kind of pressure that exists when someone with institutional proximity to power speaks to you with expectation. It's not physical. It doesn't have a temperature or a texture, but it's real in a way that lands somewhere in the chest, a kind of gravitational pull toward compliance, toward smoothing things over, toward the easier path that says, just do it, it's 1 second, who is it hurting? I felt that pull. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here as someone who found it easy, who felt nothing, who was so certain of himself that the moment passed like water over stone. I felt the pull, and I stood still anyway. Because there's a difference between what someone near power wants you to do and what you have been ordered to do by the chain of command you actually belong to. And collapsing that difference, especially in a moment of quiet, low-stakes social pressure, is exactly how integrity gets slowly, invisibly dismantled. My orders came from my regiment. Not from a brooch and a composed expression. The aide's tone shifted, not dramatically. The very controlled don't allow themselves dramatic shifts, but there was a sharpening. I'm not certain you appreciate the significance of this morning. I appreciate it, ma'am. Then you'll appreciate that a small gesture of deference would be entirely appropriate. With respect, ma'am, my orders define what's appropriate for my position today. They don't include a kneeling protocol. She looked at me, really looked, the way people do when they're recalculating, and then said, quite flatly, I can have this raised with your commanding officer. I'd encourage you to do that, ma'am, I said. My co would be in the best position to clarify my orders. There was a silence. Not a long one, but the kind that has weight in it. Then she turned and walked back across the forecourt, her heels precise on the stone, and for a moment the square was very quiet. I remained still. My breathing was steady. Inside my chest, something was not quite steady, but that's what training is for. That's what years of standing inside your own stillness is for. The surface holds even when the interior is churning. I should tell you about Corporal Declan Marsh. Because Declan was at his own position, approximately 30 feet to my right, and he had, without any doubt in my mind, heard every word of that exchange. Declan was from Belfast. He'd grown up in a part of the city that had, in his own description, given him an unusually early education in the mechanics of authority, who actually held it, who only claimed it, and what the difference looked like when the pressure was applied. He was 28, 2 years my senior in service, and he had a quality I'd always respected enormously. He never performed respect. He either gave it or he didn't, and the people he gave it to were always the people who'd earned it, regardless of what they were wearing. I couldn't look at him. Eyes forward always. But I knew he was there. And somehow, in the specific way that soldiers develop their own language of shared experience, I could feel that he had seen what I'd done, and that it sat right with him. That mattered, not because I needed his approval, but because there's a difference between doing something right and doing something right while someone you respect is watching. Both feel like something, but the second one feels like something you can carry forward. 20 minutes passed. They were long minutes, the kind where time seems to conduct itself at a different pace, where the light off the stone feels like it has a texture, where you are aware of your own heartbeat in a way you aren't during ordinary moments. I heard the footsteps before I registered what they meant. Not the aide's heels this time. These were heavier, more deliberate. The footsteps of someone who is not hurrying, who is not hesitating, who is moving with the specific intention of arriving at exactly the right pace. Sergeant Fowler materialized from the interior corridor. He walked to within 4 feet of my position, stopped, and looked at me. I didn't look at him, eyes forward always, but I could feel the quality of his attention. The kind of attention Fowler gave you when he was conducting an assessment, and you were not going to know the result until he decided to give it. He stood there for a moment. Then, at a volume pitched precisely to me and no one else, "I've had a call." I said nothing. "Someone has suggested there's been a failure to follow an informal protocol request this morning." "Yes, Sergeant." "Did you fail to follow an informal protocol request this morning?" "I followed my orders, Sergeant." A pause, which were: standard ceremonial protocol, Queen's Guard standing orders, no deviation without written authorization from the duty officer. Another pause. "And the request that was made to you fell outside those orders." "Yes, Sergeant." I heard him exhale once through his nose. It was the exhale of a man who has, once again, been confirmed in a judgment he'd already formed. "Carry on, Calloway." He walked away, and something in my chest, which had been held very carefully still for 23 minutes, eased just slightly. The procession came at 11:40. I won't describe it in granular detail. There are aspects of palace operations that belong to the institution, not to my account. But I will tell you what it was like to stand in my position on the inner forecourt as it passed. There is a quality to those moments that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't stood inside one. The sense of occasion, yes, but not just occasion. Something older than occasion. Something that has been practiced and refined and handed down across so many years that it has become, in its own strange way, a kind of truth. I stood at my post. I did not kneel. I performed my duties exactly as I had been ordered to perform them, with full attention, full composure, full respect. Every element of what I did was correct, disciplined, and appropriate to my role. And when the procession passed, I continued to stand, as the forecourt settled again into its ordinary silence, and the light off the stone shifted as the cloud cover thinned slightly, and somewhere beyond the walls, London continued its enormous, indifferent existence. I had done the right thing. I was fairly sure of it. And I was also aware, in the way you are aware of things that come with a cost, that the morning was not quite finished. It was Preston who told me, during the changeover, that there would be a formal review. "Don't let it put you off your lunch," he said, which was Preston's version of reassurance. I wasn't off my lunch. But I was, if I'm honest, quieter than usual. There was a particular kind of alone that settles on you when you've done something that the institution is still deciding whether to validate or punish. You've made your call. You've committed. Now you wait for the world to tell you what it thinks. I sat in the mess that afternoon and drank tea that was too strong and thought about my father at the kitchen table. About the way he held himself together not because anyone was watching, but because it mattered to him that he did. The formal review was scheduled for Thursday morning. In the 2 days between the incident and the review, life inside the regiment continued with the kind of ordinary efficiency that military institutions maintain regardless of whatever drama is currently being processed through their administrative systems. Duties were assigned, meals happened, kit was maintained, and the world, as it always does, kept going. But the atmosphere around me had changed, not in any loud or obvious way, nothing so simple as ostracism or solidarity. It was subtler than both of those things. People knew, in the way that people in a tight institution always know what has happened, often before any official account has been given. The details moved through the informal channels, a conversation in the accommodation corridor, a look exchanged over a meal tray, the quality of silence when you entered a room, and what those details communicated was something like, "A thing has happened, and we are waiting to see what it means." Private First Class Tom Yardley, 23 years old, from Swindon, the kind of young soldier who was still in the process of deciding what kind of man he was going to be, sat across from me at dinner on the Wednesday and said, without preamble, Was it worth it? I looked at him. I mean, he said, they might. He didn't finish the sentence. I know what they might, I said. So was it? I thought about it honestly. Not the way you answer a question when you want to sound impressive. The way you answer it when a young man is watching you and deciding things. I didn't do it to make it worth it, I said. I did it because it was right. He thought about that for a moment. How do you know the difference between right and worth it? Yeah. I turned my mug in my hands. Worth it is a calculation. Right is something else. You don't calculate it. You know it or you don't. He was quiet. When they review you, he said eventually, what happens if they? Then they do, I said. And I'll have to live with that, but I'll know why I did what I did, and so will you, and so will Fowler, and so will everyone else who was in that forecourt. He nodded slowly, like someone processing something he hadn't expected to be relevant to him yet. I called my mother that Wednesday evening. Not to tell her what had happened, I didn't tell her the details. She didn't need the weight of that, and besides, she would worry in the specifically exhausting way that only mothers worry, which involves asking the same 3 questions in different orders until you've answered them 14 times. I just called to hear her voice. She talked about the neighbors, about something the council was doing to the road outside, about my youngest brother Danny, who was apparently taking a course in digital photography, which she described with the combination of pride and bafflement that she brought to anything involving a screen. I sat on my bunk and listened and said very little. Before she hung up, she said, "You sound tired, Jimmy." "Bit, yeah. Are you all right?" I thought about the forecourt, about the aide's measured voice, about Fowler walking away after carry-on. "Yeah, Mum," I said, "I'm all right." "Good," she said, and then, because she is my mother and knows things without being told them, "Whatever you're dealing with, you'll know what to do." I held the phone after she hung up. "You'll know what to do." She'd said it like a fact, not a hope, not an encouragement, a fact. Thursday arrived with thin winter sun, and a frost on the ground that made the stone of the parade yard look like it had been etched. I dressed carefully, as I always did, then I went to the review. The room where these things happen is not a dramatic space. It's an administrative room, functional, adequately heated, containing a table and chairs and the particular quality of artificial light that makes everyone look slightly more serious than they actually feel. There's no ceremony to it, which in its own way is appropriate, because what happens in that room is not ceremonial, it's real. My reviewing officer was a major whose name was Ashcroft, 50s, compact, the kind of man whose neutrality of expression told you nothing and everything simultaneously. He had my file in front of him. He had, I gathered, also spoken with Sergeant Fowler and with the duty officer who had issued my orders for Tuesday morning. He looked at me for a moment after I entered. "Sit down, Calloway." I sat. "You know why you're here?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me what happened." I told him, precisely and without decoration. What I had been briefed, what had been requested of me, what I had said, what I had not done. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at a point somewhere to the left of my face. "Was there any ambiguity," he said, "in your orders for Tuesday?" "No, sir." "Were you uncertain about whether the request fell inside or outside those orders?" "No, sir." "At any point during the exchange, were you rude or confrontational?" "No, sir, I was respectful throughout." He nodded once. "That's consistent with what's been reported." Another pause. "The request that was made to you," he said, "was not authorized. I've confirmed that. It was communicated by an individual acting outside their appropriate scope. Your orders were correct, and your adherence to them was correct." I remained still. "However," he said, and I heard the however land with the weight it intended, "the manner in which these things are handled, the management of a situation like this, is a matter of considerable delicacy. You are dealing with individuals in proximity to a principal. The potential for misunderstanding that would have required diplomatic management was significant." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" I met his eyes. "Yes, sir. I understand that there were possible consequences that extended beyond the immediate situation. I understood that on Tuesday morning. I made the same decision regardless. He looked at me steadily. Why? It's a simple question, 3 letters. But it's the question that everything hinges on. Because my orders are my orders, sir, I said. Not suggestions, not guidelines that can be overridden by the immediate preference of someone with proximity to authority. If I kneel when my orders say I stand because it was convenient, because it would have smoothed something over, then my orders mean nothing. And if my orders mean nothing, then what I represent means nothing. Silence in the room. The artificial light hummed very slightly. That's what I represent, sir, I said. That's what the uniform is, and I'd rather face this review than compromise it. Major Ashcroft looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed the file. He didn't give me the outcome immediately. I was told to return to duties and that I'd receive the formal result by end of week, which is how these things work. The administrative process has its own rhythm, and it doesn't accelerate because you're anxious. I went back to duty. I stood my next post on Thursday afternoon, outer gate, gray afternoon. A school group from somewhere up north pressed against the railings in matching anoraks. A teacher trying to organize a photograph with the kind of defeated optimism that defines school trips. I stood still. I watched the light change on the stone. I thought about nothing in particular. And in that particular kind of nothing, I found the thing I'd been looking for since Tuesday, a feeling, not exactly of peace, but of alignment, of being in the correct relationship with myself, of having been the same person in the hard moment that I was in the ordinary ones. It's quieter than you'd expect, that feeling. Less triumphant, more like putting something down that you've been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. The result came on Friday afternoon, in the form of a typed letter that Sergeant Fowler handed me without comment and walked away from immediately. I read it alone, sitting on the edge of my bunk. The formal finding, no misconduct, orders correctly interpreted and followed, adherence to standing orders confirmed appropriate, no further action. And then, at the bottom, a single additional line that was not quite standard administrative language. The regiment's confidence in Private Calloway's judgment and character is noted. I sat with that for a moment. Then I folded the letter carefully, put it in the small wooden box I keep in my locker, the one that has a photograph of my grandfather and the cap badge from my father's old Army cadet uniform, and a note my mother put in my kit bag when I left for basic training that just says in her handwriting, "Remember who you are." I put the letter in with those things, because that's what it belonged with. I spoke to Declan Marsh that evening, first real conversation we'd had since Tuesday. We were sitting outside the accommodation block in the last of the autumn light, which was coming in low and orange across the rooftops, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly like a painting. He had a mug of something and was looking at the sky, and he said, without looking at me, "You know the aide came back." I looked at him. "Thursday," he said. "Different business, nothing to do with you. But she walked past my position and she looked at me for a moment, you know that look, and then she walked on." "Right. And I thought about what you'd done," he said. "And I thought if she'd come to me on Tuesday instead, what would I have done?" He was quiet for a moment. "What would you have?" I said. "I'd like to say the same as you." He turned his mug in his hands. "I'm not completely sure." "You would have," I said. "You don't know that." "You'd have thought about it the same way," I said, "because you understand what the orders are and what they're for. The moment you start making exceptions for people who haven't earned them, you've given the uniform to someone who hasn't paid for it." He looked at me, a long, assessing look. "That's a bit dramatic, Calloway." "Probably, but not wrong." "No," I said, "not wrong." We sat in the orange light until it was gone. The months after that were ordinary mostly. Ordinary duty, ordinary rhythms, the regiment continuing in its enormous, unhurried way, absorbing events, and returning to steadiness the way institutions that have existed long enough do, not because nothing happened, but because the continuation is the point. I went home to Wolverhampton at Christmas. My father was better than I'd feared. Not the version of himself I held in memory from when I was young, but present, steady, himself in the essential ways. We sat at the kitchen table on Christmas evening, just the two of us. my mum and brothers having gone to bed, and he poured 2 small measures of whiskey and put one in front of me and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Your mum told me something happened at work. She doesn't know the details. She knows enough," he looked at the table. "She knows you did something that was hard to do." I didn't answer. "Did you handle it right?" I thought about the forecourt, about the aide's voice, about the question why in that administrative room, and my own answer coming back to me in a way I hadn't planned but had somehow always known. "I think so, Dad." He nodded, drank his whiskey. "Good," he said. And then, because this is my father, who learned everything he knows about strength from 31 years of arriving on time and doing his work and holding himself to a line, he said nothing else. He didn't need to. I've been asked, since then, by younger soldiers, particularly the ones still finding their footing, still working out what the uniform means to them, what I would tell them if I could only say one thing about that Tuesday. And I always give the same answer. The discipline isn't about the standing. It isn't about the bearskin or the forecourt or the hours of cold and silence and not letting your face show what your knees feel. Those things are training. They're the preparation. The discipline is about knowing what your orders are, knowing why they exist, and then, in the one moment when someone with a quiet, confident voice asks you to set them aside for the sake of convenience, choosing to remain what you are. Not because you're rigid, not because you don't understand context, but because the version of you that bends in that moment is a smaller version, and you live with the version of yourself you choose, every day, in every mirror, in every quiet moment before sleep. I chose to stay the same man I was trained to be. That's all. There's a moment on a clear morning when you take your position on the forecourt and the light is right and the stone is cold and the city is just beginning its noise beyond the walls. There's a moment where you feel the line you're part of. Not metaphorically, physically, as if you can feel the weight of everyone who stood in this place before you and everyone who will stand hereafter, and you are just the current point in that line, holding it where it needs to be held. I think about that often. I think about it when the doubt comes, which it always does. When you wonder whether it mattered, whether any of it mattered, whether one man's quiet refusal to kneel when his orders said stand made any real difference in the large, indifferent machinery of the world. And I think yes. Not because the world noticed, not because anyone wrote it down somewhere as a significant event, but because I noticed, because Tom Yardley noticed, because Declan Marsh sat in the orange light and said not wrong, because the letter is in the wooden box with my grandfather's photograph and my mother's handwriting. Because the line held. And sometimes, in the life of a man who has chosen to be part of something larger than himself, that is the whole story. The line held. And on the days when everything else is uncertain, when the world is loud and the pressure is real and the easier path is right there, within reach, I come back to that. The line held because I held it. And I held it because I knew who I was.